Hi everyone, so this is Dr. DeBoer, and for this unit we are going to talk about equine parasites. So this topic, I really enjoy it just because it's constantly changing, and I think so many people are unaware of the current recommendations of how to handle parasites in horses. So hopefully throughout this unit I can teach you a little bit more about it. So first, beginning with what a parasite is. These are going to be small organisms living on or in and at the expense of a host, in this case, the horse, and they have specific evolutionary adaptations used to attack that host. And we're going to divide these parasites into two main categories, our ectoparasites and our endoparasites. And so hopefully with that prefix, it'll give you a pretty good idea of the difference between the two. But ectoparasites is referring to the parasites that are outside of the body. So these are going to attack the skin and body openings. And we're going to consider them lice, ticks, flies, mosquitoes, often exhibiting this persistent feeding on the muzzle, the eyes, open wounds, consuming blood from the horse. These are ectoparasites. But for this unit, we're going to focus more on endoparasites, which are the parasites we find that live in internal organs, body cavities, and tissues. And so some of these parasites will be like our tapeworms, our large and small strongyls, ascarids, bots, pinworms. Some can even kind of fall between the two, where we see them as both certain stages are endo and others are ecto forms of these parasites. So I want to give a little bit of an overview of equine parasites and cover some big topics as we start. And so one thing I want to bring up is, are parasites species specific? And the answer to that is pretty much yes. And so that is great news. And so we'll just say mostly. So horses are going to have parasites that are pretty specific to them. As a result, we're not going to see parasites transfer to other species such as goats, sheep, cattle, llamas, alpacas. We can see some similar parasites within donkeys, and so there can be some sharing between those forms of our equids, but with other livestock, we don't, and we'll talk about how this can be effective for parasite management in the future. Another thing I want to talk about are the three main goals of deworming. And these are going to be really important because I'm assuming they're not what you think they are. Most people think that the goal of deworming is to rid the horse of all parasites. And while that would be great, it is a fairy tale and it's not going to happen. So that is not our goal. We're never going to rid our horses of all the parasites. So there's three things that we want to do instead. One thing we want to do is minimize the risk of parasitic disease. So ultimately, we know our horses are going to have parasites. We just don't want these parasites to negatively impact their health. And so that is one of our goals. One way we can help minimize this parasitic disease is by the control of parasite egg shedding. So the less or least amount of eggs we can put into the environment, the more we're going to lessen that exposure for all those horses, which is a great way to help control this parasite transmission, ideally without having to rely on dewormers. And then the last goal is going to be to maintain effective, we'll say, anthelmintics. So these are going to refer to like our dewormers that these drugs use to treat parasites. And so we want to maintain effective anthelmintics to avoid resistance. And so we'll talk about resistance later as well, but it's, similar to what we would have talked about if you talk about or think about antibiotic resistance. Basically, these parasites are losing their susceptibility to these dewormers. The dewormers are just not as effective at controlling these populations. And so we want to make sure the management practices we use to control our parasites are not leading to resistance. We're finding ways to keep these dewormers effective. And so the other main thing I want to talk about is the life cycle of the parasite, because knowing this life cycle is going to help us learn how to control them and also determine how this is different for different types of parasites. And so looking at this picture, we are going to have a few different stages, or I guess two main stages of our parasite life cycle. Our free living stage is going to be when these parasites are outside of the horse's body and they're developing in the environment, versus our infective stage is when these parasites are within the horse's body and actively infecting them. So what we can say is the free living stage is the period of development outside of the host, which means the infective or the parasitic stage is the period of infecting the host. And so every parasite is going to go through these stages differently, and we're going to talk about them because knowing these life cycles is going to help us be able to control them. But just know that these parasites kind of go through this cyclical life cycle. I mean, I guess it's a life cycle, so cyclical makes sense, but it just repeats itself between being outside and inside. And these are all happening simultaneously. It's not like all parasites are eggs and then larvae and then infective. You'll have some within the horse, some outside the horse, which is why we can't just rid the horse of all parasites. They're always there. They're always in the environment, and our horses are constantly going to be exposed to them. Okay, so this is kind of the overview of what we have with our equine parasites.